Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Concepts from the Global South podcast. Here, we explore the connections between the past, the present of non European societies with the help of antique, classical, modern, emic, ethic concepts. My name is Alp Eren Topal. I am a historian of the late Ottoman Empire with a particular focus on key social and political concepts and their genealogies. Today, we will be discussing the concept of Shura with Alisa Shablovskaia, who is a postdoctoral fellow at University of Oslo, Department of Oriental Languages and Culture Studies. Alisa, could you briefly introduce yourself and what you have been doing?
Hi, Alp. Thank you for having me today. I'm still a novice to the history of concepts. My PhD dissertation dealt with the dynamics of decolonization and Russian imperialism in Iran between the First World War and the rise of the Pahlavi dynasty in the 1920s. So my first encounter with Iranian concepts was, so to say, marked by the Russian colonial gaze. And this is what made me interested in the proper Iranian understanding of these concepts misunderstood or instrumentalized by Russian and Soviet propaganda. My current research project, The Concept of Shura in the Modern Turco-Persian World, examines the specifics and legacies of the Khajar 19th century court literature on governance, and also the literature in 20th century Iran, from the Constitutional Revolution to the 1979 revolution and its aftermath. It is not only about different definitions of Shura, but also about emotions, how one should act if he or she becomes a member of a consultative assembly. I'm also interested in how Iranian Islamists framed Shura within the framework of their anti-communist agenda. Finally, the last part of the project deals with the place of women in the discourse on consultation and the female voices within this discourse.
Great. Then let's start with the basics. Tell us a bit about this word, this concept Shura. Where does it come from? What is its genealogy? What is its etymology? When does it figure? Just let's start with the basics.
Shura is an Arabic word. It comes from the verb which, according to modern Iranian scholars, means extracting honey from honeycomb, but I'm still not certain about this. Shura is an extremely polysemic term. And even if we only consider its appearance in the Quran, its polysemy becomes already tangible. For example, according to the Quran, God ordered the Prophet to consult with his followers. He also ordered the believers to consult with one another. And God also ordered parents to consult each other. So basically, everybody must consult or seek others' opinion in most of the important moments in life. We can also look at the meaning of Shura in the Quran from a historical perspective. Shura is the word used in the Quran to describe the practice of consultation among the tribes populating the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century. This is, by the way, similar to tribal societies everywhere else, and also similar to non-tribal social contexts when decision-making process is anchored in the consensus, backed by the ruler or the leader. Shura is also a concept developed in the Islamic theosophy at the intersection of Kalam and Falsafa Sunni traditions, as well as in more esoteric Sufi Shi'i tradition. It can also be defined as a process of acquisition of knowledge through consultation. In the 19th century, the term shura, which became a pretty abstract notion in Islamic governance, was used to designate all kinds of consultative institutions in the Muslim world, from court councils to state councils and parliaments. In the 20th century, shura became one of the conceptual pillars of political Islam, an antipode to the Western liberal democratic model. When sovereignty belongs to God and not to people, shura becomes an institution of secondary importance. The believer's opinions should be sought, but not necessarily taken into account by the elite, who probably knows the God's ways better than the masses. Communist propaganda also translated shura as Soviet, or Soviet as shura, if we think about Islamic languages in general. Today we can say that all of these meanings coexist simultaneously in the concept of shura or shura in Iran.
Great. So you are basically saying it's a concept that acquires these kinds of multiple contexts in the 19th century, but has obviously a long past in the Islamic tradition. Uh, could you tell us a bit about the before moving on to other questions, other words that are derived from Shura? Because Ottoman context, I would at least recognize it, the word in its different forms, like meshvere. or müşavere, even again from the same root, but expressing different usages, practical usages of the word, basically. Are those usages present in the Persian context as well?
Absolutely. I mean, these are the intricacies of Arabic grammar, making a noun from a verb. Shura is more of a place or assembly, and mashwara is more of a process of getting advice. But I think they are pretty synonymous. There is not that much difference between them. And yeah, of course, they are also present in this literature in Persian, but also in the literature in Arabic, or even in the Arabic passages inside the treatises written in Persian.
I see. That makes sense. Actually, that was my impression too, because I have seen shura, meshvere, and other derivatives used both in noun form and then also as a verb or in the infinitive form too. So I wanted to corroborate that too. So, but then why is the concept of Shura so important to understand, particularly in the case of Iran, its past and present? Why did you choose to study it?
Well, personally, I chose this topic because of the entanglement between the communist discourse on councils or Soviets and the Islamic discourse on Shura. I was previously more interested in Soviet propaganda, so this was the primary reason of my choice. But if from a more mature theoretical perspective, I would say that Shura is central to various genres of political writing in the classical Persian Islamic tradition. So these genres laid the basis for the later literature on politics and morality in the Islamic world in general. Throughout history, the concept was adapted to different socioeconomic realities, but also continuously framed within these classical genres. So the discussion of politics in Iran and in the broader Islamic world has been pretty much reliant on these genre conventions. If we know how consultation was discussed in this literature, we can better understand its dynamics of power delegation, building of social consensus, or democratization. Second, the democratization in the Islamic primordial politics began with court institutions called shuras in the 18th century. You'll probably disagree with me, Alp, and talk about the primordial democratization process, but I'll just stick to this classical narrative. So, of course, the growing knowledge of the West and the general flow of ideas created a tension and entanglement between the old concept of Islamic Shura and its new meaning as a state council or parliament. Many institutional novelties in the 19th century Middle East were mere emulations of European politics. We should acknowledge that. That's true. But one just must admit that this democratizing potential of Shura and its capacity to extend agency and build a more egalitarian and inclusive society within the Islamic rhetorical tradition is also true. This tradition persisted throughout the 19th century and is still alive nowadays, I think. Third, in Iran, Shura was central to the clergy's political claims since the constitutional revolution of 1906. Such thinkers as Naini defended the constitutional model by associating it with the Quranic principle of Shura. But they also maintained that it necessitated clerical supervision. So, to a certain extent, I would say these were the precursors of Khomeini. The Islamic Republic of Iran is often qualified as an obscurantist regime in Western media. But these Islamists have also built on the polysemy of Shura, and very often to their own risk. Finally, today Shura as institution and as concept is still central to the negotiation of agency and power in Iran. Who is allowed to consult? In what circumstances? Is the Shura format or consultation format in line with the people's needs today? There are indeed many people in Iran who argue against the Islamic Shura, such as Abdul Karim Soroush, for example. There are also people who argue against Shura in general. But to bring down something, you need to actively engage with it and deconstruct it. And this is what Iranians are doing today.
That's interesting. I mean, to briefly answer your pass to me, I actually, yes, I believe there are precedents of consultative practices in the pre-modern era, but I would still agree with you that the 19th century concept, shura, as it emerges in the Muslim communities as a key term, is definitely modern. I mean, it definitely carries the tensions and uh, ambiguities of the new thing called mass politics. I mean, because before that, I mean, it's important that you highlighted this point about who to consult with, because, you know, it's the frequently referred Quranic verse, وَشَاوِرْهُمْ فِي الْأَمْرِ. Translated, it says, and consult with them in your businesses, in your affairs. But who is them? Of course, who are you supposed to consult with? Who is worthy of consultation, and whose opinion matters, whose word matters? So it is understandable that in the 19th century, with the general overhaul of ancien regimes all over and the introduction of mass politics, this becomes an issue. So just to clarify my own position here. Let's continue with other questions then. So in Europe, the history of consultation is usually associated with the development of chambers, within the context of cameralism and councils in the early modern era. These councils enable the state to have a more direct relationship with its subjects and extract more taxes. Were there similar institutions in Iran or the broader Middle East, we could say? Or how did the religious notion of shura relate to the political institutions? How was the connection made?
The literature on empires often emphasizes this difference between Europe and Middle Eastern politics, which is linked to the status and power of intermediaries. It is true that the ruler's authority and direct relations with his subjects in the primordial Muslim empires contrasted with Europe in these terms. But we know little about the intermediaries in the Middle East. Recent research shows that they were way more powerful than we imagined before, especially given the scale of regional economic growth in the Primordial period. And their position evolved with the general economic conditions and social setting. The rhetoric on Shura was part of genre convention, but it was also taken seriously by rulers who grounded their legitimacy in it. So the genre conventions contributed to the continuous importance of consultations, but the politics of consultation was progressively changing. In Iran, it was the creation of Shia hierarchy in the Safavid Empire, but also the growth of Sufi networks after the Safavid decline and collapse, which shaped the new class of imperial intermediaries. Not surprisingly, we can witness the resurgence of rhetoric and consultation in the late Safavid literature. Of course, state councils were not institutionalized until the 19th century, and royal patronage was the core of Iranian political life until the constitutional revolution. In this sense, this royal patronage or step patronage tradition differed from the Western practice of negotiation with imperial intermediaries. In the Middle East, it was more of a brokerage or bargaining over the access to resources. The patronage model was sometimes seen in Western academia as the essence of Shura, and this is quite interesting actually. For example, in the 1990s, Roy Muttahide defined Shura as something like Mohammad Reza Pahlavi's style of leadership. And that's something some former Shah's ministers told him. These were just the friends of Roy Muttahide. The consulted always expressed their consent with the Shah's opinion according to this model. But again, I think we tend to underestimate the primordial intermediaries' growing power in the Islamic world. Today, many historians are redefining even the 20th century Pahlavi system, not as specifically step patronage or Perso-Islamic model of governance, Iranian or patrimonial per se, but as a part of a global one-party state movement.
Very interesting, especially the fact that you highlight this nuanced difference between the consultation or this shura as more of a leadership act of consulting versus something rather different. Maybe we could even, I guess, talk about demand for shura from below versus shura as something initiated by the Shah or by the monarch itself, because the literature on, for instance, Ottoman concepts of consultation and this kind of consultative practices in the 17th and 18th century particularly highlight this, the first kind of shura, like, or meshvere, as something desired by the monarch or the grand vizier, so that the decisions taken have a broader legitimacy. It's kind of a communicative act, a kind of public diplomacy, even. Whereas in 19th century, we see more of a, the demand from below, or would it? I'm not sure, but that I leave it to you. So in relation to that, I'm gonna ask, can we say that consultative assemblies and the idea of it, the idea of shura as a political institution, did it come from the West in the case of Iran at least? Or could we say that it came from the West?
First of all, I want to pick up on what you just said about the popular demand for shura. Of course, we don't have the sources which would enable us to see how ideas were circulating in the public sphere beyond this core system of knowledge production. But the fact that classical Persian literature was read out loud in the cafes, which multiplied during the early modern period, both in the Ottoman Empire and the Safavid Empire, says a lot about the language of popular politics. Also, Rumi was one of the most popular authors in 19th century Iran. His books were printed and reprinted, commented upon, and widely praised in all kinds of literature on governance. We can think about the broader engagement with this concept, or the popular language of claiming agency expressed through those quotes, this classical literature. But back to the Kharja Shura, the court council. It was Nasser-ad-Din Shah who established the first state council, or Shura-i-Dawlat, in 1858. The British envoy, who was at that moment in Tehran, reported that it was his suggestion that Shura-i-Dawlat was actually based on the British model. The idea was to prevent the emergence of an all too powerful prime minister, such as the father of the Kharja reform, Amir Kabir, who was killed by Nasser-ad-Din Shah, by the way. However, Nasser-ad-Din Shah himself resorted to the classical Persian Islamic rhetoric on shura to legitimize this institution. The council sessions were also shaped by the Iranian court culture. So even if the idea came from the West, it was completely transformed and appropriated by Iranian statesmen. As an example, during the first sessions, they were feasting, and the Shah was angry with his ministers because they didn't want to discuss affairs like Europeans. They just wanted to eat, drink, and have fun. And sometimes these sessions were held in other ministers' houses, not in the proper shura place chosen by the Shah. And all of these details were used by the Iranian statesmen to claim the Iranian court tradition. When the Shah was criticizing them, they were responding something like, "Don't you know that your glory depends on how we praise you through the feasting?" We can also think about Ottoman inspirations for the Iranian Shura, or about the model of local religious assemblies in the 20th century as a factor shaping the Islamist rhetoric. So Ali Shariati, the father of the Islamic Revolution, in his correspondence, talks about our shuras, not shura as a political model, but shura as an assembly of like-minded Muslims.
That's the feast thing and the different locations for these shura assemblies. I want to talk a bit about that because in a way, I think it betrays one other aspect of this shura or this notion in general, because it recalls to mind another very related concept, that of mejlis, a gathering, where you basically, meet with your peers. It could be both urban or more rural thing, but basically a mejlis is where, you gather with people, drink, eat, be merry, and also share, poetry, wisdom. It's basically the epitome. There's been epitome of this urban culture of mingling. There's been a lot of literature on this in the early modern era, in the modern era, their role in educating and, disseminating etiquette and, all things that shaped over a long durée. So maybe in 19th century, this confusion regarding where this gathering takes place, how do you gather, how do you consult, maybe carries some trace of this. Mejlis and Shura, those are interchangeable words. But on the other hand, I also realized the timeline quite neatly aligns with the Ottoman case. I mean, there were lots of consultative assemblies, different trials and experiments in the early 19th century, but Ottoman Shura-i Devlet, basically Conseil d'État or Council of the State, was established, if I'm not mistaken, in 1860s, maybe 1865 or 67. And afterwards, some decade later, Shura-i Ümmet was introduced. But it seems, I think this point about, the Western diplomats saying they actually proposed or suggested or introduced the idea. Shouldn't we take this with a bit of grain of salt? Because I've seen many examples of similar claims in 19th century case, especially from British diplomats, interestingly, who are very um, how do you say it, arrogant and about it's a bit too boastful about their impact and influence on Oriental societies. So I'd like to pick your mind about that too.
Yeah, absolutely. We should take it with a grain of salt. And this was not the first case that during the reign of Nasruddin Shah, the Westerners were claiming the original idea of Iranian reform. Just 10 years before, in 1848, after the death of Nasruddin Shah's father, Muhammad Shah, there was a committee of statesmen which was established after his death. And this committee was called Umaroi Jumhur. The rumors were saying that we can see Western influence here. Indeed, what would Jumhur means in the mid-19th century Iran context? A party, a bunch of people, nothing particularly political. So it must be inspired by the French envoy and his ideas of republicanism. But as your own work shows, it could also be inspired by the Ottoman context, or it could be something which was in the air, ideas circulating in the broader Middle East. So, yeah, these narratives of Western conceptual inspirations are, of course, not something we should completely trust. But on the other hand, I think we should take into account that those exchanges were taking place, and the British envoy did have this conversation with Nasruddin Shah. So the Shah's idea about the State Council and Shura was changing too.
I see. And eventually, I think the blind spot here is that, as you said earlier, that we have very limited access to popular discourse and what really came from where in the absence of written documents. And I'm realizing more and more in the heavy presence of state censorship, which actually stifled a lot of public debate, or it should at least prevented it from making it into print or just accessible sources. Uh, all right, let's continue then. So a more direct question. How democratic were different Iranian shuras, these assemblies? Were they seen as a break from the past, something new, or just, part of the tradition, something, that was always there in one form or another?
Well, it is difficult to talk about democracy and inclusion when we only have these elite sources you just mentioned. Another thing is, what is democracy? I'm sure there is no consensus about it, and it depends on your own background, your own rhetorical tradition, so to say. Kosellec's definition of democracy as something turned to the future and promising infinite extension of agency is more of a utopia to me. I think even Western countries seem to have renounced to it. But of course, this patronage model is applicable to what we can witness in the 19th and early 20th century Iran, maybe even during the Pahlavi reign. On the other hand, for sure, we can see a similar democratic progression in the Muslim world as we have in the West with the concept of council. The meaning of council evolved from the assembly of the learned men to revolutionary tools and then to council democracy. And the same is true for Shura if we look at the full political spectrum of forces promoting Shura as political model in the Middle East. The democratization process goes even further today on the rhetorical level in the Iranian novel. because of the legacy of Shura as a tool of spiritual self-improvement. Novels on Shura call for a profound conceptual and societal change, just like in Sufism.
Now we are going into a new territory, Sufism. So, what exactly is the role of Sufism in the history of Iranian shuras or general Iranian political development, even?
I have not yet wrapped my mind around this question, but I'll try to answer it from two perspectives. So the first one is the language of Sufism, which was a transnational language of reform in Islamic societies in the 19th century and probably even earlier. In Iranian literature, we find numerous quotes from Rumi's Masnavi in the 19th century. My favorite one is about the story of lion, fox, and wolf who hunt together. And so the quote says, "The divine command, consult them, came to the prophet, though no counsel is to be compared with his own." And this is about the lion, who is the master of the house, who is the king, or maybe even a representation of God. The story itself isn't told in the treatise, but if you know the story, the lion doesn't seem to be the key character. When the animals want to divide their prey, and the lion asks the wolf what he wants to and how he wants to divide it, the wolf says that the prey should be divided equally because it's a fair way to do it. So the wolf's proposal is rejected by the lion. The lion is displeased with the wolf. And when the fox's opinion is solicited, the cunning fox says that all the prey should go to the lion. Finally, the lion gives all the prey to the fox. And well, if you look at the original source, in Masnavi, Rumi says, "When you become selfless in the right way, verily the lion and the lion's prey are yours. Every prize and every gift of grace which exists is for the sake of the servants of that king or god." So yeah, we see a complete reversal of hierarchy and roles between the ruler and the ruled in this story. But I mean, come on, this was written in the medieval period. We're not talking about democracy here. But in the 19th century Iranian context, this quote acquired a whole new meaning because there is already the state council, there is this developing reform literature, which was, by the way, developing in parallel with the traditional mirror for princess genre. And there are also conceptual entanglements between the Sufi teachings and Western civilizational discourse in the Iranian constitutional treatises in the early 20th century. Iranian reformist thinkers like Malcolm Khan, for example, wanted to create revolutionary cells based on the Sufi brotherhood model. There is also this famous verse of Rumi about Attar, which was quite often cited in different kinds of treatises. So the quote goes as follows: "Attar has roamed through the 7 cities of love, while we have barely turned down the first street." This verse was transformed into the following: "While other nations roamed through the 7 cities of progress and civilization, you Muslims have barely turned down the first street." So we see a certain genre continuity here, but it's not only about the genre. It is also about the general conception of the universe and what consultation and knowledge is, and how it can be acquired, and what role it plays in the construction of the Iranian civilization in the moral, spiritual sense. The second perspective on Sufi influence in the Iranian discourse on Shura is the social perspective of the post-Safavid Sufi revival. The Sufis were pretty much impressed during the Safavid reign, but after the collapse of the Safavid Empire, the Sufi brotherhoods multiplied and came back and gained in significance and energy. Iranian Sufis were involved in the regional development of Sufi networks and rhetoric, and probably they were quite influenced by the Naqshbandi teachings on spiritual renewal and other Sufi schools too. But what I would say is that the rhetoric on the legitimacy of Shura and the rhetoric on the extension of agency was kind of hijacked by the Shi'i clergy from the Sufis by the early 20th century. It was the Sufis who, during the 1830s and 1840s, revived this Sufi rhetoric on consultation because they wanted to become closer to the Shah. They wanted to have more powers than the established Shi'i scholars. But by the end of the 19th century, this critique of the clergy turned into the critique of the ruler. It turned against the ruler. And at that moment, both the clergy and the Sufis were engaging in the same conversation, despite their perpetual conflict in the 19th century. So by 1906, the Iranian constitutional revolution, I would say that the rhetoric on mashwara or consultation became almost entirely appropriated by the clergy. We're not talking about Sufi Shura anymore. We're talking about a clerical Shura. And this is interesting because it changes our perception of the roots of political Islam.
I really like the way of putting this in two lines, one 19th century Sufi organization and activism, and also Sufism as a kind of long tradition, a rhetorical or discursive tradition that allows one to speak of or make sense of their own actions, or just subjectivation or subject formation in life. Because most of the time we forget that when talking about Sufism, it's at once a kind of very long discursive tradition that enables one to speak of meaning of life, a kind of telos of life based on a kind of very transcendental conception of love, uh, and especially the tales from Rumi. It immediately reminds me of other examples of what we would call very basic social education works, like Sadi Shirazi's Bostane Gülistan. I always find myself, for instance, thinking back to those when I used to read them as a child, because I was given them to read. My family treasured these things, so I always thought that those things kind of help me see world in a certain way. Almost, I would say, they're like political education manuals, but in a very basic sense. I'm thinking of this definition by this British conservative thinker, Michael Oakeshott. He defines politics as pursuit of intimations, a kind of trying to get your way, find your way in life. And the story about, Fox outsmarting the lion and having his way through rhetoric, it's exactly that kind of brings up this kind of notion of politics, a very basic, simple, humane act. But on the other hand, we also forget that Sufism was always a way for the society, for the people to self-organize in a way, in the absence of other kinds of forms. So the tekke, the lodge was basically the hanka was a political space. Although we most of the time uh, we are reluctant to see it or admit it as such. Sorry, I'm just taking my time here, but you mentioned early 19th century and Sufi activities. I want to ask one specific question. Again, my personal interest, but might be relevant, especially considering you are also focusing on the Caucasus and the Turkic world too. I am increasingly attracted to the Caucasian, the Circassian leader Imam Shamil, who was basically elected from among his peers, and became a guerrilla leader for the Circassian people, in the Chechen people in the Caucasus, again in their war against Russia. And I understand, especially Shamil's legacy, his almost 25 years of guerrilla warfare and resistance against Russia. It left a deep impact. And, it- when you speak of the Sufi activism, are there such cases, or do you think there are kind of these mutual influences between these relatively close geographies? This is more of a, speculative question, but.
When we talk about Persian Sufism, well, the first thing which comes to your mind if you're Persian is the school of Isfahan, which was a pretty elitist organization. And well, of course, it attracted people from other countries too, but it was a specific Shi'i school of theosophy with its own logic. So today it's also considered as an expression of Iranianness, so to say. I know very little about the exchanges between the Persian Sufis and the Caucasian Sufis, but I know that Russian authorities in the 19th century were very cautious not to provoke the wrath of Shi'i mujtahids from the Ottoman Iraq, exactly because of the influence they might have on Russian Muslim subjects. Also, I think that this aura of anti-imperialist resistance associated with Sufism is something which made a difference in the 19th century and which influenced many other like-minded freedom fighters or Sufis in the broader Middle East and Central Asia. I think there was a dynamic of synchronization, or maybe synchronization is not the best term to use in this context, but similar developments were taking place in different places in the broader Middle East. We have some research on how late Safavid Sufi brotherhoods adopted a nearly nationalist rhetoric when Sufi sources talk about foreign invasion, the Afghan invasion in the early 18th century. So the Sufi brotherhoods were acting as nation protectors then. And I think it can be compared to what we have in the Caucasus. It follows a similar logic, a global logic of modernization.
Thanks. This is very explanatory, very revelatory actually, because I can see the similar patterns of Sufi activism and attitude in 19th century Ottoman Empire too. As again, especially considering their capacity, their ability to mobilize people in all places, we see that they very frequently Sufi figures acted as mobilizers. For instance, remember this young Sufi sheikh from Baghdad, who recruited 3,000 young men to come with him and fight in Crimean War in the 1850s against Russia, for instance, just voluntary fighting force to go and fight an imperial war. So that kind of rings a bell with what you said as well. All right, let's continue with my questions. So let's get back to this Russian connection, the concept of Soviet. Shura is used in Persian to translate the concepts of both assembly and Soviet. So was this conceptual overlap intentional or accidental, contingent? Did this overlap, influence the way Iranians understood parliamentarism or communism? So, in addition to a potential or demonstrable Western influence or impact, can we talk about a Russian impact, Soviet impact here?
I would say that this overlap was, if not invented, but firmly implemented by Soviet propaganda. There were also people who resisted this propaganda. For example, there were Uzbek reformist thinkers who were co-opted by the Bolsheviks, such as Abdurrauf Fitrat. Fitrat systematically avoided the term Shura when he spoke about the Soviets. He wanted to distinguish between the Soviet, like the Russian thing, and Shura, the Islamic thing. But who were the Soviet propagandists and translators who were using the term Shura? They were actually local Muslim reformists who were building on their own political traditions. The earliest translation of Soviet into Persian were not related to religion, but often used the term anjuman or committee instead of shura. However, in the Russian Empire, there were also Tatar translations of Soviet as the Shura from the Russian Revolution of 1905. And these translations were produced by the Muslim reformists, influenced by people like Abduh Afghani or Al-Manar Journal from Cairo. All these entanglements contributed to the Islamic communists after the October Revolution of 1917 beyond Soviet propaganda. But Soviet propaganda also did a great job. The classical and esoteric meaning of Shura persisted too. Notably, it created confusion in the late 1970s in Iran during this revolutionary upheaval when Iranian factory workers started to organize their councils on the Soviet model. And in these councils, workers were approaching shuras not as a means of empowerment, but as a source of expertise. Actually, they were seeking less to make revolution, but more to share knowledge.
That's interesting. Soviet propaganda. That explains some stuff, at least for me. I mean, I remember seeing in the literature on Ottoman history of the word this one scholar actually thought at one point that the word Shura in Turkish was actually a calque of the Russian word Soviet, completely ignoring or forgetting its other genealogies. So Russian propaganda, I guess, or Soviet propaganda would partly explain this, I guess. But also, I'm intrigued by the use of the word "enjumen" because it was also used in the Ottoman Empire. The first Council for Higher Learning and Education that was instituted in 1840s and 50s to basically decide on the works to be translated from European literature. It was called Encumeni Danish, which basically means a consultative gathering, actually, again. So that makes me think, actually, there is a lot of words for this kind of, uh, assembly, basically, Encümen, Meclis, Shura, Meşveret, uh, you know, so that maybe at one point a proper mapping of these concepts would be an interesting project. But anyway, let's continue. So how did the Soviet, propaganda overlap or shape the clerical discourse on the true Islamic Shura?
I would say that when talking about the overlap with the Russian word Soviet, we should also think about the overlap between Shura and parliamentarism, which came about earlier. But these two overlaps themselves did little. It was the systems of power in place which made them significant. So, concerning communism in the Pahlavi era, anti-communism or anti-constitutionalism in the 1920s, all of them became the very definition of the Islamic Shura. The Shah was the main sponsor of the clerical Shi'i anti-communist literature. The clerical rhetoric on Shura was a patchwork of Western and classical Islamic discourses, and sometimes they were truly original. For example, a treatise from 1926 by Al-Marandi talks about Shura as an ultimate conspirational model, which is a sign of the apocalypse or the October Revolution coming to Iran. Ali Shariati, the father of the Iranian so-called Islamic Revolution, also comes up with a complex calculation model, saying that 10 years of the Prophet's rule are equal to 250 years of the Shi'i Imam's rule, before the Shura should be introduced. But as Hussein, the grandson of the Prophet and the Shi'i Imam, died, and things took a wrong path, it will take thousands of years to prepare mankind for real Shura. Shariati also says that Shura model is not adapted for tribes, so the global south would need more time to prepare its population for consultation than the West. And in both cases, the case of Shariati and the case of Al-Marandi in 1926, they are all somehow related to the Turks. And this is very interesting, because Al-Marandi points at the developments in the former Ottoman Empire and Turkish republicanism. Shariati, at his turn, promotes the Shi'i model against the Sunni model of Shura, also building on the same logic. The old Sunni-Shi'i conflict, which we can find in the classical political Islamic literature in the 14th century, for example. But yeah, this confessionalization of politics and Iran-Turkey relations clearly played a role in the history of entanglement between Shura and democracy. And also the regional entanglements of different equivalences of Shura, democracy, republic, or constitutionalism. But back to the overlap between the Soviet and the Shura, we can also say that it created new opportunities for both camps to come together. And here I'm talking about the Islamists and the communists. So they could extend their influence greatly, and they fought the Shah's regime together, hand in hand, in 1979.
I want to insert one question here, particularly following upon Shariati's remarks about a true Shura requiring almost 250 years. That's kind of confuses me, or rather just intrigues me, because in Ottoman case, at least, those who say people are not ready for shura, or at least that argument, the kind of people are not ready for that, how are they going to come up, ignorant people, and discuss things in assemblies, the kind of the returning back to the question of who are we supposed to consult with, who is worthy of consultation. So this kind of people are not ready argument is usually a conservative argument to fend off, demands for consultation and parliamentary and assembly forms, to which usually Ottoman authors, like for instance Namık Kemal, immediately rejects and says, no, everyone knows somehow what in their best interests, and actually politics is not that complicated, that commoners, or rather just someone from the rural side, towns, wouldn't know what's the best interest of the state or the people. So well, how do you read Shariati's remark here? Is it just a way to glorify or just highlight the the uniqueness of the prophetic experience, or is there something else?
I guess Shariati wanted to engage with the idea of patronage and the role of patronage in the Iranian political culture. So his civilizational discourse on the superiority of the settler populations over the tribes kind of makes sense in the Iranian context if we keep in mind this recurrent pattern of redistribution of resources by the ruler, the Shah. Shariati's main argument is that tribes do not consist of independently minded individuals. They just follow their chief. So to become an independently minded individual, you should follow the prophets or the imam's path at least for 250 years. But Shariati's discourse, I would say, should be seen in continuity with his father's work, who was one of the leading figures in this 1940s, 1950s production of anti-communist Islamist literature in Iran, which was also sponsored by the state. This anti-communist continuity, even if it was sprinkled with some Marxist ideas and inspirations, further developed during al-Shariati's stay in Europe. And I think it all can be traced back to Al-Mirandi's writings, or even earlier anti-constitutionalist literature.
Interesting. So you are basically, saying there is that tension here between tribal mindset that was still quite strong in Iran, and the kind of individualist urban politics that is supposed to replace that. I see that makes a lot of sense. All right, now let's get to our final question without extending this too long. So, coming back to present, in what ways is Shura still an important concept for the Iranian society? I mean, is it making a comeback somehow? Are there any significant cultural or political manifestations of the concept in today's society? So, how is it?
Well, the concept made its major comeback in the 1980s when Khomeini announced the creation of urban councils. But throughout the last 30 years of the history of the Islamic Republic, the reformist camp wanted to build on this idea of city councils to democratize the republic. This process was stopped in 2020 because of the state who didn't want the urban councils to supervise anyhow the municipal elections, and the regime hardened its stance in general. But the concept, the discussion on Shura, is still alive. The publication of Fariba Wafi's novel titled Another Day of Shura, Ruze Digar Shura, in 2020, in a way announced a new era in the life of this concept. Fariba Wafi created a female character whose name is Shura and whose father was an Iranian communist. Her main problem, the problem of Shura, is that she is always following the other's opinion, mainly those of her husband's relatives. Her journey of self-discovery through the experience of romance with another man stands for a post-communist and also post-Islamist critique of Shura from a gender perspective. It is important because the classical Perso-Islamic discourse on Shura excludes women and is extremely hostile to them because supposedly women don't possess reason. Fatih Babafi's character chooses to pretend stupid to avoid the orders from her family, her shura. This development is so much in line with the woman life freedom emphasis on body politics and corporeal liberation, not necessarily an intellectual one. Interestingly, the trickster character of the novel, who pushes Shura, to seek her independence, is referred to as a dervish or Sufi. So we still see this esoteric continuity, and I think this is fascinating.
Thank you. This has been really informative and highly interesting. Thanks a lot, Alisa, for sharing your work, your research with us.
Thank you all.
Looking forward to reading more about this through your articles and hopefully forthcoming book. Uh, for those interested, you can find relevant literature in the podcast description. Thanks for listening to us and stay tuned for later episodes. Thank you.